Yo guys, welcome back to another video on this channel. Ever wanted to build one of those interactive drag and drop dashboards where you can move around widgets as you please and also resize them? Well, today I present to you Gridstack.js, which will help you with exactly that. Gridstack.js creates a grid which we can add widgets to. This is also responsive because as a grid it kind of behaves pretty predictably. Gridstack.js is also framework agnostic since it's a library for vanilla JavaScript. You can actually use it completely without a framework. So whether you're a Svelte, React or maybe Vue lover, Gridstack.js still got your back. So without further ado, let's go ahead and install Gridstack.js. Alright, so here we have the Gridstack.js GitHub page where you can read a lot about it. You can also find the documentation for the project. But as you can see here, it's a mobile-friendly modern TypeScript library for dashboard layout and creation. So if we scroll down a bit, we can see how we installed here. Just like usual, we can use yarn or npm depending on your preference. So here I'm in an empty project. I'm just going to run npm install and install Gridstack. And there we go. After that we can just go ahead and import these things here. And this CSS file is actually used for things like drag handles and also some other CSS for the layout to make sure that things used right width and heights. But other than that, this is all we really need to do to install Gridstack.js. So Gridstack.js works by creating this grid stack divider here that has the class grid-stack, and that tells Gridstack that it's supposed to render a grid stack inside of it. So if we go to main.ts and just run this gridstack init, and then we also add a widget, we can now see that we have a widget here, an item 1, which we can also resize and move however we like. Isn't that beautiful? So we have some options here. We can specify the width and the height and the x and y coordinates of our widget. And the content here is actually HTML. So you could put something like some bold text instead if you would like. If you want to have an item 2, you can see now that that works as well. And if I set the width here to 8, you can see that it's much larger now. So if we have multiple items, they will be laid out automatically by Gridstack. So we can see we have item 1, item 2 and item 3, and we can move them around however we please. But something that you might have noticed is that we can't really move it wherever we want. It's kind of stuck here. And that's because Gridstack is in a space preserving mode. It's actually using as little space as possible for rendering these widgets. But if we want to change that, we can actually pass in some options to Gridstack. We can pass in float and set that to true. So then we will have a floating layout. And then we can place them wherever we want. We can place them really far down here, or we can place them pretty much exactly where we want inside our grid. If you do not want to create widgets dynamically, you can actually create them in the DOM as well. You can create them inside of this document. So we can create a Gridstack item just like this. It needs to have the class Gridstack item, and then we have the content here. So if I set something like item 4 here or item 5, we can see that that is being added here as well. And if we want to set some settings for this, for example, if we want to set the x and y, we could do something like gsx, set that to 4 and gsy to 10. You see that it appears down here. So these options can be added to the DOM as well. Of course, we could just add this here as well. We could just do x4, y3, maybe height as well. We can try height 2. Now you can see that this item 1 here is a little bit larger and it's placed down here instead. And if you have them in the DOM as well, you might be using a framework like React or Svelte. Then you can actually render it inside the DOM and then run Gridstack init, and it will actually make them Gridstack items. So something worth noting about Gridstack is that it's working with rows and columns. Just like we specify x and y here, it actually has a fixed size of columns. The rows are pretty much infinite. You can see you can pull this down how far we want, but the columns are actually fixed to a specific limit here. And the default amount of columns is set to 12. So if I were to create this item 1 instead at x12, we can see that it's placed to the rightmost here. And this will be the case for any screen size. And that's what makes Gridstack so useful, because you can have kind of predictable layouts. If we always want it to be placed here to the right, then we would set it to 12, since that is the column. The columns will be based on the screen size. We will simply have 12 columns, and they will have different sizes, of course, depending on how large the screen is, but we will always have 12 columns. So if you want a bit more flexibility in how you resize them vertically, we can actually set that with the cell height property. So we can do something like cell height, then we can set that to maybe 40. So now we see that we are much more flexible in how we resize them. We can have a bit more fine-tuned height of our widgets. It is also possible to change the amount of columns, but you will have to work a little bit more. If you wanted to have less columns, so let's say we wanted to have 4 columns, we can actually just specify here column 4, but then we also need to add an extra CSS file because Gridstack actually needs to have a CSS file to determine how the layout should be. So if we want to have less columns, we can just use this Gridstack extra min. So let's go ahead and import that. So if we now set that to column 4 and imported that, we can see that we now have 4 columns, and that is all great. If you wanted to have only 4 columns, you can configure that very easily. But if you do want to have more than 12 columns, you want to have a bit more fine-tuned approach for the columns as well, you will need some custom CSS, and it's not that difficult actually. We can actually use something here like a generator, this SassMeister thing. If you just plug this into this SassMeister and set how many columns you want, in this case 20, then it will generate the CSS for you, and then you can just add it to your project and import it, and it should work flawlessly. It's also possible that you don't want to be able to drag the whole card. You might want to only have the title be draggable, and that is of course also possible in Gridstack.js. And it's done by first adding whatever you want as your drag handle. I just added a nice little divider here with a height 20 and set the cursor here to grab. And what we do then is just specify here the handle. So here you can just specify the CSS class or an ID perhaps of a handle that you want to have to make only that draggable. So only when I hover over this handle here is it actually possible to move this item. It's also possible to make a grid a subgrid, which will allow us to have nested grids. Isn't that really cool? So we can actually create a grid inside of another Gridstack item. In this case, we have this item here where we actually have a grid inside of it as well. I can actually pull in this super cool content and move it around inside of this grid as well. And this has its own options. We can see now that this one actually has 12 columns. So whatever we pass in here to subgrid options will create a completely new grid. It will have exactly the same option set as the root grid stack, so to speak. And in order to let it actually accept new widgets from another stack, we can just set accept widgets to true. So if we do it the same for the root grid here, we can see that if I pull this in, then I can also pull it back out. That would not be the case if accept widgets was set to false. And of course, you can move this bad boy around with other widgets inside of it and resize it as you please as well. And that will stay responsive. If you're creating something like a builder where you might have a toolbar of items that you want to add, then you kind of want to have an infinite supply of these items. You want to be able to drag out new items without them actually disappearing from the stack. And that is of course possible with Gridstack as well. So we can have this sidebar here where I pull out sidebar items onto my other grid, but they stay intact, they stay infinite here. And the way to do that is just by calling in this function here, Gridstack, set up drag in, and then specify which kind of items should be able to be dragged in. And in this case, we just use normal CSS rules. All of the items, Gridstack items inside of the sidebar class. So all of these items inside of here, I just created them. You can create this dynamically with something like React or Vue or Svelte, whatever you like. And then we can just pull them in. And the key here is to set the helper here to clone. We can actually define our own cloning function if we wanted to, but this is just a default built-in function called clone, which will clone the item when we pull it out. If I were to remove this helper clone, we can see that it will actually disappear. So you might not want to have an infinite supply, and you can do that as well. by not having a clone. Of course, there are also events that you can add to your grid, such as added or drag stop, and this will help make it really easy to create a saving functionality. So if you want to listen for changes to a grid stack and then save it, maybe to a server or database, you can do that as well. So whenever I pull something out, we can see that we get the added event called with a list of grid stack items. And if I move this around, we can also see that we get events here for drag stop. And it's of course also possible here to do this whenever you have resized something. So whenever you have finished resize something, you can also save to database. Now you might be wondering how to work with responsiveness inside of Gridstack.js. It actually have a really nice API that was recently added actually. So you can now set breakpoints for how you want your grid to behave at the different screen sizes. So in this case, I set for mobile, I set that to have only one column, and this is kind of how we expect it to work. We expect to have like one column with just one item in a row like this. And then when we are on a larger screen, we can just have them like this and it will automatically just work. Isn't that beautiful? And that is super easy to set up. We can just pass in this column opts and then set in breakpoints. So I set here at the breakpoints at the width 768, I have one column. And there are loads of more options available. If you want to have another kind of flexible layout, I definitely recommend checking out the docs for that. Now you might be wondering a bit more concretely how you can use Gridstack.js with a front-end framework like React or Svelte. I will show you both React and Svelte, but it will be very similar for other frameworks like Angular or Vue or anything like that. So the principle is pretty much the same. We just want to have access to an actual DOM element that we want to create a widget out of. So you can kind of have any kind of dynamic component, just like we have this widget test here. That will still work with Gridstack.js. All we really need is an actual DOM element that we can have access to. So how do we do this then? Well, here I just have a really basic React.js application set up, and then we just use ref here to get access to the actual DOM elements. And then here we loop over items. So I have some set items here, one from 0 to 3. And we loop over all of these items and we create grid stack items. Just remember here to set up all of these class names properly. Of course, here we can just configure it with width and height just like normal. And then we have a content divider inside of this other divider. And inside of here, we can just render our widget component, any kind of dynamic component really. Pass in props or do anything you like. All we really need is the DOM element, and we get access to that by using ref here in React. We just set that inside of this map that we created with the use ref, and then we just set that DOM element. So how do we actually add a widget? Well, we press this add widget button and it will create a new widget for us. And the key here is to use the function called make widget. So this will work since it will actually create all of these widget items, since they have this class name grid stack. Whenever we use effect here, whenever the component has mounted, Gridstack will look up all of these dividers with the Gridstack class and make them widgets. But when you have a new widget that you want to add dynamically, we just need to run make widget to actually create a widget out of that. So here we just pass in the actual DOM element. I could actually console log this just to show you guys. If I press the add button here, we can see that we have this divider here. We have an actual normal vanilla DOM element, and that is the key to making this work with other frameworks. So you just have Gridstack.js working inside the React app. It's not that difficult. And for Svelte, it is of course very simple as well. We just have on mount, so we just initialize the grid stack whenever we mounted our app component, and then we do pretty much the same thing. We have a list of items that we loop over, and then we use bind this to bind the actual DOM element to an entry inside of this object. So we map the number here from these items to the HTML DOM element. Just like before, we have these two classes which are kind of vital to have, Gridstack item and Gridstack item content, and then we render our dynamic widget. You can have anything inside of here, any dynamic. You can have a button that handles some state or whatever you like. And we just bind this, and whenever I press add widget here, it will create that widget by running make widget. And I didn't mention this for React version, but we actually want to use set timeout here because we need to make sure that the element has actually been added to the DOM. So we could actually check here to make sure that it's actually part of this ref. You would definitely do that in a production code base. You need to make sure that this is actually being mounted. You could also do this inside of the widget itself and do something like on mount here, pass in a reference to the grid itself. So whenever this is mounted, we could actually use bind this inside of the widget itself to make that a Gridstack widget. But all of that is of course possible. I just wanted to show a very quick and easy way to do this with React and Svelte. So that's all I wanted to show for Gridstack.js, a really neat library for making interactive dashboards or really anything with a grid for resizable drag and drop purposes. It's absolutely wonderful, and there are loads of different configuration options available. So if you have any thoughts or opinions, feel free to let me know in the comments. Also feel free to like or dislike the video depending on what you thought of it. Also feel free to join my Discord channel if you want to be part of the community. But other than that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.